All right, sorry about the delay. I got sidetracked. Welcome back to Mecha Mondays. I'm your intrepid narrator, Pilot Fragath, and today we have a pulpy, kind of trashy treat in the form of ManFac by Martin Caidin. Um, so this was written in 1981. Um, and for a quick heads up on Martin Caidin, he wrote a lot. He is what I would generally consider a pulp slash dime store novel writer. Um, so, for a little perspective, right at the beginning of this edition, which is a Dell, I guess before they became Del Rey, um, a Dell book, we have a list of his, a list of a number of his written materials. So right at the beginning we have, and it is, I kid you not, 2.5 whole pages of bibliography here, and I'm sure he read, and this is just in 81. So novels by Martin Caidin, ManFac, Jericho 52, Aquarius Mission, Cyborg, which gets adapted into the $6 Million Man. Operation Nuke, The Long Night, High Crystal, Cyborg Roman numeral 4, The Last Dogfight, Devil Take All, No Man's World, The God Machine, Anytime, Anywhere, Whip, The Last Fathom, The Mendelov Conspiracy, Four Came Back, The Cape, Almost Midnight, Mary Jane Tonight at Angels 12, Wingborn, The Final Countdown, The Three Corners to Nowhere, Starbright, and then it has a dividing mark saying Selected Books by Martin Caidin, and here we are going to have to speed up considerably because we will be at it forever. The Saga of Iron Annie, Kill Devil Hill, The Tigers Are Burning, The Fork-Tailed Devil, Zero! Samurai! The Ragged Rugged Warriors, Black Thursday, Thunderbirds! The Long Lonely Leap, The Long Arm of America, The Mighty Hercules, Let's Go Flying! Cross Country Flying, Test Pilot, Hydrospace, The Winged Armada, Air Force, Golden Wings, Thunderbolt! This is my land! Everything but the flak, A Torch to the Enemy, The Night Hamburg Died, Barnstorming, Boeing 707, Flying Forts, Flying, Messerschmitt Me-109, The Zero Fighter, The Mission, The Silken Angels, When War Comes, It's Fun to Fly, The Power of Decision, JU-52/3M Flight Manual, BF-108B Flight Manual, Rendezvous in Space, Man in Space Dictionary, Spaceport, USA, The Astronauts, War for the Moon, I Am Eagle! Rockets Beyond the Earth, Red Star in Space, Jets, Rockets, and Guided Missiles, Rockets and Missiles, Planetfall, Destination Mars, Vanguard! Countdown for Tomorrow, The Greatest Challenge, Aviation and Space Medicine, By Apollo to the Moon, Man into Space, New World for Men, Why Space? First Flight into Space, Worlds in Space, Overture to Space, and my personal favorite, etc. So that's not even a full body of his work. And yes, a lot of them are like plain books and space. He graduates to space at some point or goes backwards. I'm not really sure. I don't know if these are done in reverse order or not. It doesn't give years. Anyway, so flight manual indeed. So I'm not going to pull up like a Martin Caidin Wikipedia article or anything. He says as he's about to pull up a Martin Caidin Wikipedia article. Suffice it to say, he wrote a lot. They're all dime store novels. They're like He was probably paid by the page, or by the word, or not, as the case may be. Um, Highly prolific, and frankly kind of trashy. So this is all basically to prepare you for the fact that this is not going to be up to my usual standard in terms of literary quality. You have been warned. That said, this book's actually pretty beefy. It clocks in at a bit shy of 400 pages. And I am going to also warn you, I am going to ham it up a bit because I've got to. I need to stay sane. I've had a long weekend, and it's going to be this way. Let me, and you'll see just how trashy it gets later. I don't think we're gonna quite get to it this time round. Let me see. Suffice it to say, he has quite a bit of sexy time. The main character. It's a lot. Like it's a distracting amount. It's less that there. It's less the amount and more the context, and we'll get into the context when we get there. It's really not very much actually, but he thinks about sex a lot. I do remember that, and I don't think I'm just imagining that. Where is? There we go. There we go. First 5 chapters should cover us pretty well. Okay. So again, y'all have been warned. Thank you again for tuning in. Optical antenna. I'm sorry you have to tune into this. Um, the other reason I'm doing it is because the main reason I'm doing it is because it's reasonably adjacent to powered armor, and you'll see how we get there. It's gonna take a little while to get there, but we will. We will, in fact, get there. Well, actually, that one has... Oh, that's 10 fewer pages than I thought. Oh, let me see if I can get through chapter 6. Yeah, that should be reasonable. That splits it up nicely. We'll get through part 1 and by the end of next week. Okay, I'm missing all of my bookmarks. Where are they? Did I bury them? I think I buried them. Oh no. Okay, you'll do. Splat. Splat part 2. I don't know where they went. Anyway, yeah, so brace yourselves. ManFac is coming. And he's coming for you. Well, probably not. You are going to see some overlap with superhero stories. There's definitely some power fantasy involved in this. Okay, there's a lot of power fantasy involved in this. You'll see. We'll get there. Oh boy, will we get there. You also kind of have to wonder where the money comes from. I think they talk about that a bit, but not as much as I would like. Anyway, let's get cracking. I'm going to get some fluid in me, as well as some ibuprofen because my head's killing me. And we'll start reading ManFac by Martin Caidin. Beyond the Bionic Man, an ingenious new thriller from the creator of the $6 Million Man. More than a man, more than a machine, nothing can withstand the force of ManFac. So, as a quick insight into my book purchasing process, if it's not something by an author that I am looking for, see Exhibit A, uh, any number of authors that I haven't got the full collection of at this point, or Absolution now, when that comes out in a couple days, by Jeff Vandermeer, or something someone has recommended me. I'm going into like used bookstores and seeing what thrills me. Like, I will buy based on cover. I am that petty. Uh, I will occasionally buy based on book cover. Sometimes rear description. The rear description of this has too many ellipses, and at that point I was like, this is going to be trashy gold. And it's definitely one of those things. Uh, I also saw a $6 million man. I'm like, ooh, I like Cyborg. They're cool. And, oh, it's by the guy who did $6 Million Man. Shh, 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 shh. After Image. It was, it had to be there. Anyway, um, and there was a $6 Million Woman show at one point. I don't think it was ever a book. Who did that star? That starred someone worthy of note, I think. $6 Million Woman. And it's like who's a spin-off. Oh, I'm not inventing that. Come on. Don't do this to me, Wikipedia. You're not good as a source of information. It helps that I don't know how to spell dollar. It's okay. It's okay. Oh, the Bionic Woman. Sorry. And I guess they had a crossover? They did. They had several. Who was it? The Bionic Woman. Here we go. Lindsay Wagner. Who is also in... was she really in nothing else? Wow, I'm not seeing her in anything else. I thought she was in a movie. Maybe that was the movie. Oh well. Oh, here we go. Nope. I recognize none of these, so never mind. I'm thinking of someone else. Anyway. Have I mentioned that television back then was different? it was different. I didn't say better, but it was different. Anyway. Wow, she's in a bunch of stuff recently, too. Good for her. She is kept with it as a bit character. Maybe I saw her in something else. I don't know. Anyway, that's the ramble done. We only took 15 minutes to do that. Okay, let's get cracking. ManFac by Martin Caidin. Book 1. Chapter 1. He couldn't see. No, that was wrong. He couldn't focus. His eyes worked, and there was vision, but everything before Lance Parker blurred. He stared vacantly, then blinked rapidly, and again tried staring, forcing his eyes not to blink. No damn good. He still faced that eerie shimmering, the kind of blur that comes from heat waves screwing up a horizon, or if the air itself was shaking. Jesus, this was crazy. Lance squeezed his eyes shut tightly, and strange spirals and whirls danced along his inner retina. The redness increased from the blood pooling in his eyes. Now he felt and sensed and tasted what was happening. He had that deep gut sensation that makes dogs howl and birds dart about swiftly on wings of panic. He understood why the air blurred before him, and it didn't have a thing to do with vision.
He opened his eyes, and instantly he wanted to vomit. His equilibrium staggered, and vertigo knifed from his brain to his stomach. Bile appeared in his throat, hot and choking. He threw out an arm in an instinctive and hopeless motion. He saw the walls about him quiver, felt the floor tremble beneath his feet, and then quietly he said, "Oh, shit," because an earthquake makes a man so goddamned helpless. There was no way he should have experienced more than a mild shock so far down in the bowels of this mountain in Northern California, unless there was enough punch in the quake to have kicked the Richter scale right in the nuts. And Richter was getting the hell stomped out of him. He listened, every muscle straining, his nerves taut. No doubt now, he couldn't hear the deep thrumming thunder always present within this thick-walled and reinforced assembly of steel and concrete, the thunder from the underground river that sliced through the enormous pipes. He couldn't hear the familiar thunder because that other thunder was louder. The first knife-point edges of claustrophobia cut into his mind. He was way down in the belly of the land, and an earthquake could swallow him, mash him, crush and pound and squeeze him until his bones and teeth would flow with scrunched concrete and steel rods and raw granite. The only things louder than this thunder were the shocks that pounded his ears inside his skull with great ringing peals. Did a man's brains really shake like jelly in that cranial packaging? He stared in fascination at the dust dancing in the air, and he cursed himself for his fascinating but useless perceptions. He lurched like a drunk to his left. At least he was moving. He stumbled to the readout control panel and a nearby control console. Every damned light was flashing red. For the first time he realized sirens were screeching through his hearing, and two small speakers in the same control room wailed their danger cries. He'd heard these sounds individually before, but never in this insane chorus. Smoke shimmered up from broken circuits, and sparks flashed from metal, and he discovered he was staring at one large, brilliant red light that visually drowned out everything else. The rad level was climbing like a baboon within its ass ablaze. Oh, with its ass, not with it. Never mind. The rad level was climbing like a baboon with its ass ablaze. That meant that somewhere deep within this hydroelectric power system, or what the world had been told was hydro, the mighty nuclear fast breeder reactor was suffering the horrors of having its radioactive innards wrenched. The fear welled up in him, and he forced it back. Hell, he had confidence in this system. He'd designed the major safeguards himself, had watched them built, had tested them through every phase of assembly and operation. The great power system was built on a massive hydraulic platform that would easily have balanced both World Trade Towers in Lower Manhattan. Both World Trade Towers in Lower Manhattan. I hope, he said to himself. The world rattled about him, and he had that mental picture he hated. His body being shaken like a helpless rat in the jaws of some mighty terrier. He focused his attention as best he could on the display panel with its myriad lines depicting tunnels and elevators, and even stairwells that traversed 500 feet. 500 feet before a man could open a sealed, thick armored lock and peer into open air. Then he lurched and stumbled, fell, climbed to his feet, and lunged for the doorway to an adjoining equipment room. Hanging from a rack was his personal salvation. His flailing hands reached what looked like an armored version of an astronaut's spacesuit, but it was more complicated, designed for surviving killing agents tougher than vacuum and cold. The entire suit was woven with a double-walled interior layer of coiled lines filled with water, power packs hanging about a belt that ran heaters, coolers, dehumidifiers, radios, tools, and enough complicated gadgets for a small submarine. A man in that suit was intended to survive freezing cold and winds, even naked flames, to be able to absorb physical punishment, and, above all, to have protection against the invisible juggernaut of lethal atomic radiation. Lance looked at the rising scale of surrounding radiation on a wall counter. Just one glance was enough to make him climb into the suit. Within 2 minutes he was sealed. Within 2 minutes he was sealed, solid canisters pouring fresh oxygen under pressure into to the helmet. Wow, that felt weird. There's a line break that shouldn't have thrown me, but did. Within 2 minutes he was sealed, solid canisters pouring fresh oxygen under pressure to the helmet. He studied himself in a dust-covered mirror, pressed a row of suit test buttons on his right forearm, and picked up and hooked several more oxygen canisters to the suit belt. He had half turned to leave the equipment room when the wall to his immediate right cracked wide open. Rock and crushed concrete spewed out in a frightening stream, and a blast of thunder penetrated even the suit. The shower of rocks and dust rattled in a grisly rain against the suit as he leaned forward, compensating for the weight and mass of his radiation armor, to get the hell away from that increasingly violent jet gushing from the smashed wall. He made it through the doorway back into the control room and turned to slam shut the heavy door between the two rooms. The alarms and sirens were dulled considerably by the pressurized suit, and he ignored the flashing red lights. He knew only too well what they meant. He was drawn instantly to a television monitor, ablaze with the strobe and repeated flashings of a sign that had to be the absolute understatement of the moment. Urgent. He lumbered to the set, reached to his side for a coiled power line, and plugged in directly to the TV system. A scanner picked up his picture. Instantly the urgent sign blinked out, and he saw the face of John Matterly, the power plant director. Matterly's expression, a mixture of horror and honest concern, made all preliminary conversation superfluous. To his credit, he didn't even try. His voice stabbed through Lance's earphones within the helmet. "Parker! God damn it, man! The whole thing's coming unglued! You'd better—" Matterly's eyes blinked, and he paused but a second. Thank Christ you're already in that suit! Lance, get the hell out of there! Some of the tunnels and shafts are already blocked. You'd better use the D system. It's the strongest and your best chance. Take the D tunnel from your present position to shaft 16. I don't know if the power is still on, but there's still enough battery juice to keep some lights going. Be sure to plug in as you reach the successive contact points so we know where you are and can update you on any changes. Got it? Don't even answer. Just nod to me and move. Now go, damn it! As Lance yanked the plug and started for the doorway, a wild shock smashed everything about him, and the floor jerked away beneath him. He tensed for the fall. The whole feeling was incredible, and at the same time absurd, because while he was falling, suspended, an invisible fist struck him along the side of his head, and a black fog swept through his brain. A strange, warm fog that kept him just short of unconsciousness. A long-held daze in which he wasn't sure of anything, and his mind was pinwheeling. Then it snapped back sharp and clear to him. Falling. But it was beautiful. God, they were crazy. Jesus, crazy like no one else. There were 8 of them, and it was a gorgeous day, and they were over the lake at 10,000 feet, 8 maniacs laughing and grinning in the DC-3 jump plane, outfitted in goggles and wetsuits beneath their parachute harnesses. It was a contest like that which no one had ever tried before, and it demanded skill and experience, and, above all, the kind of timing that had to be perfect, or you were going to bust your ass, baby, and that was for sure. They were all pilots and skydivers and scuba divers, and they climbed mountains and went on hunting and fishing trips in desolate and angry country, and they were always trying to find some new gimmick, some new way to test themselves, and challenge one another in a unique, or, best of all, in a completely unprecedented way. They had their own private jump club. Al Collins was jump master for this gig. He wore a crazy wetsuit of rainbow colors. He looked insane. But like Lance Parker, he had had more than 400 jumps, and he was very, very good. "One last time," he said, "and I want you cats to listen carefully." He glanced outside the DC-3. "We're coming around for the jump run, and I want no mistakes about the rules. We go out in 2-second intervals, right?" They nodded to one another and Al. "Good. From 10 grand, everybody has a chance to spread wide. You've got to crack your canopies no lower than 6 thou. That gives everybody a chance to get good separation, and you've got to go by the numbers. 1 through 8, just like we've set it up. Okay on all counts?" They nodded. Yeah, okay on all counts. Lance felt a thrill of anticipation wash through his body like a cool wind. He glanced through the DC-3 window at the deep blue of the sky and the scattered cumulus clouds below. A perfect day, wind about 12 knots, but they'd be dumping toward water. Except for their crazy target. Everything seemed extra sharp, extra bright. He could almost feel the seconds ticking away. He was mad with a sudden desire to hurl himself from this clanking, winged monster. He felt the short jabs on rudder, the aft fuselage swaying as the pilot held course. He could feel the moment of jump coming. He was number 5 in the string, and the guys were lined up, tensed, alert, ready to go, and Al's voice called out the seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go! Benny went out first. Al's voice barked, "Go!" And Mike was next, and then Roger, and Milty, and then Lance hurled himself through the open doorway into the teeth of the 120 miles an hour roaring by the jump plane, and God, it was marvelous as the blast hit him, and he moved his arms and legs and twisted his body and went into perfect free fall position, arms wide, legs spread, back arched slightly, the wind pushing up against his clothing and shoving against his goggles, and distending his facial skin, and he was grinning as he saw the other bodies below him, and there he heard the slight popping sound as the first chute opened, and Benny's square rigger, a parasail chute that flew like a glider, was open, and then one after the other the bright canopies deployed, and he was coming up fast on 6,000 feet. He glanced at his altimeter and pulled and heard the whooshing sound of the shrouds and the canopy whipping away from his body, and he was no longer falling, but floating in a dreamlike world. "Time to concentrate, baby." His own words, unbidden, as he rode the wind. For now came the maniacal part of all this, because of what they were going to try. The trick was to aim the chute, flying it as if it were a hang glider, to a point nearly above a trampoline floating in the water. They could all handle that well enough. But next, well, it was crazy, all right. Just before he touched the trampoline, the jumper was to cut away from his chute and drop onto the trampoline, then bounce into an inflated rubber tube anchored off the trampoline. Lance watched Benny coming around into the wind, dropping toward the trampoline. He was playing it smart. He'd cut away one shoulder hookup, leaving only one connection to the chute, so he could drop perfectly at the precise moment. But it didn't work. A gust of wind caught the chute. Benny couldn't control it with just one hookup, and he splashed into the water, a good 6 feet short of his target. Right behind him, too close for comfort, came Mike, who released his chute too high and fell like a rock, flailing wildly to avoid hitting the edge of the trampoline. Roger dropped perfectly, but his bounce was too strong. He landed clear beyond the waiting target. 3 down. Milty also got a good drop and bounce, but he hit the edge of the inner tube and skidded into the water off to the side. Lance judged it carefully. He made a final steep turn and headed for the trampoline, hands ready to cut away. The others had all tried to land feet first into the inner tube, and it hadn't worked. The trampoline came rushing up at Lance, and he cut away. Immediately the tension of the harness was gone, and he fell, keeping his legs together. He hit dead center of the trampoline, got his bounce, and instantly arched his body as he went back into the air in a bastardized sort of jackknife dive. But the trampoline had shifted with a wave, and he was going up and over in a crazy, twisting turn. He swung wildly to regain his aim, but he was off, and instead of the inner tube below him, he saw the edge of the trampoline, and he hit it with a crash against his shoulder, and he knew there would be pain. But he didn't expect the savage electrical shock that tore into his legs. He screamed with the sudden agony. He couldn't understand the pain because he'd hit with his shoulder, and why were his legs hurting him like this? My God, what in the hell was happening? He snapped open his eyes, and it all came back to him instantly. He jerked away with his mind to escape the terrible reality of being deep under a mountain in a nuclear control complex with all hell breaking loose. Now he remembered the floor snapping away from beneath him, and that timeless moment he had waited to feel the impact against the floor, and he yelled again with the sudden agony, but in that last instant before blackness swallowed him, he felt the ultimate anguish of knowing there was no one to hear him save himself. You know, it's funny. I didn't intend it this way, but it seems literally every single piece of powered armor adjacent fiction that I've read on this stream has had a wham opener. I'm not sure why that's. I'm not sure why that is. I'm not sure it's intentional. Because I mean, I don't doubt that Martin Caidin probably read Starship Troopers at some point, but at the same time, like, I don't think he was setting forth to be like, I want to do Starship Troopers, but if it was actually some guy. Sorry, Martin Caidin, I don't think you actually sound like that. Chapter 2. Somebody with enormous hands and unimaginable strength jerked his legs violently. He kicked wildly, an idiot besieged with muscle spasms, and he tried to sit up and punch an armored fist into that giant's stupid face, and his head cleared. He lifted it from the trembling concrete floor and stared in disbelief at the heavy electrical panel that held him captive to the floor. Now he understood those insane spasms. Wires still led from the panel to their wall source, and they were hot, their shocks keeping his legs jerking crazily. If he continued to lie there stupidly, he was inviting electrocution. He groaned and tried to sit up, his eyes catching sight of Matterly's disbelieving face on the television monitor, and then the man's frantic gestures for Lance Parker to move. He tried, but he couldn't get balance or leverage from the still shaking and rolling floor. Dust settling about him and clinging by static electricity to the faceplate didn't help. Neither did the shrill clamor that knifed even through the thickly armored and padded helmet. That was the master alarm for the nuclear reactor, the core proper. Something had come very loose in the heart of this entire system, and hell was about to spatter violently in all directions, and not even this massive armor could save his tender ass if radioactive sludge were to flow like artificial lava over his pitifully defenseless form. I think the elephant's foot from Chernobyl. He struggled to a sitting position, grabbed a wrecking bar attached to his equipment belt, pried it beneath an open space of the heavy panel still pinning his legs, and shoved with all his strength. The scream came involuntarily from his throat as the electricity tore through the bar into his hand, and the wrecking bar flew from his grasp. No way. No way. He gathered all his strength and rolled to one side. He didn't make it all the way, but by God, he had moved. Again, another violent side motion, and one leg was clear. He kicked and squirmed and dragged himself out from under, and he made it. He rested, gasping for air. He looked up so that Matterly would see his face through the television scanner, but the light was dead, and so was the screen. He climbed with rubbery legs to his feet. The damned world was going dark on him. He looked around, baffled, then realized that lights were fading about him. Klutz! he told himself, and turned on the suit lights, one in the helmet and another at the front of the equipment belt. The shaking movement of the floor had lessened, and he found he could move without that drunken gait. He got through the cracked entranceway, turned along a squared room, and headed straight for an oval opening with a large D shaft above the oval. It was a tunnel constructed of massive steel piping with an overlaid flooring of thick rubber to insulate any occupants from the thick cables running beneath the floor panels. A long row of lights overhead illuminated the tunnel, but they flickered on and off. He wondered what the hell had gone wrong with the backup systems. Then the electrical mains to the lights failed completely, and the battery-powered systems winked on. Lance moved in his steady stride along the tunnel, forcing down the urge to run madly toward safety. He'd just heat up the suit until he saturated the life support system, and that would seal his doom. One step after another, each one measured and careful, the only way to go and keep on going. Signs on each side of the tunnel marked the distance he'd covered since stepping through the oval entrance. They helped. But all the signs in the world wouldn't do him any good if this mountain kept disintegrating about him. The thunder boomed hollowly along the shaft, and every new detonation set the dust floating again in midair, casting strange rays and beams from the battery lights, all intermixing and clashing silently with the lights from his suit. One moment he moved onward in his measured stride, and the next he was rolled off balance as the tunnel shuddered beneath him. He kept his arms wide for better balance, sometimes rocking off the side walls of the shaft. A series of sharp reports banged through the air and the tunnel beneath him, almost staccato in their repetition. He paused by a monitoring panel as he kept moving toward shaft 16. A single glance told him the grim story. The earthquake shocks were gone. The thunder and cracking reports now came now from a man-made system that was tearing itself apart, the core of the reactor. The radiation levels in the air were climbing steadily, and he knew the very dust in the air about him was already dangerous. Without the suit, he pushed away the thought. He didn't need to dwell on maybes and mights. Just get the hell out of here. Concrete dust and chips of metal showered through the air. The long tunnel shaft rocked and then twisted before his eyes, like an enormous writhing python in some infernal death throe. Metal rods appeared suddenly, tearing through the side walls of the tunnel shaft. He lunged forward to escape a jagged steel rod that nearly impaled him. The world about him had gone insane as more rods bent under tremendous strain and snapped free of their restraints, piercing the tunnel walls and quivering madly. Over the booming reports and through the thick suit he heard their cries, these huge tuning forks that sent strange groans through his body. He might just be hungry, bro. I don't know. Then everything went ominously quiet. He started forward, running now. To hell with the heat inside the suit. Death was near and all about him, and threatening to appear in a dozen different forms. He hadn't run 50 feet when he knew his instincts were terribly true. He stopped and turned as a new and different roar began to fill the tunnel about him. The blood drained from his face, and with a muttered oath he turned again and ran with all his strength. Far behind him the tunnel shaft had ripped completely open. Water thundered like molten steel down the tunnel in lethal pursuit, and he hurled himself forward, the hatch to shaft 16, leading upward from the tunnel, beckoning to him. His chest heaved, and his sweat showered against the inside of the bubble visor as he reached the hatch. He grasped a vertical handle and threw all his weight against it as water thudded against his boots. It took 3 complete turns. The water was at his knees when the hatch yielded. He shoved it upward wildly, feeling the holding mechanism lock into place. He climbed the ladder, using everything his arms had to give him, his legs swept away by the water. Each step was a huge victory, and then he saw his boots clear of the water. He was in the shaft, his heart pounding, his body screaming for relief. Not yet. He had to close the hatch. 6 more steps up the ladder, and he turned, kicking madly at the hatch. The holding clamp let go beneath his weight, and the hatch slammed down with a deep, muffled clang. He lowered himself to the hatch, standing on the curving metal, cursing the lack of room and his clumsiness. Then he had the locking wheel in his gloved hands, and he twisted until metal refused to move. He leaned back, eyes closed, refusing to budge. Cooling oxygen flooded his face, and he felt it moving through the suit. My God, I made it! Above him extended a long, dangerous, and muscle-straining climb. Then he remembered the footholds and the hand clamps from the power lift. Power lift. He set his feet into the slots, grasped the clamps, and squeezed, bracing himself for the upward movement. Nothing. The power was dead. He forced himself to breathe deeply, steadily, measuring every move he made. The old mountain climbing trick. You go up one step at a time. Nothing exists save your present position and the next step. 1, then 2. 1 again, and then 2 again, and back to 1. Every step a careful, selective process. 100 feet straight up. That's climbing a ladder in a 100-pound suit, the equal of a 10-story building. Jesus Christ! What the hell did they expect from a man? 10 stories below him. Take a step. 10 stories below him. Take a step. Stop. Breathe deeply. Keep the system flushed with oxygen. You're burning energy like water spewing from a garden hose. Don't run out of adrenaline, God damn it! Another step. 20 stories straight up from the tunnel. 200 feet. He'd done it. He stopped, stars flashing before his eyes. He was dizzy. He must rest. He did. It would be easier from here on. The shaft bent now at a 45-degree angle. He started climbing. The vertical ascent eased greatly. Continuous thunder, the mountain shaking like jelly, then quieting down, rested for its own renewal of angry tremors. One step after another. Climb, crawl, keep moving. Sweat poured down his neck. He'd long overloaded the cooling capacity of the suit. Screw it. He was making it. He reached level F. 5 more levels to go, and he'd be at the surface control room. He paused at another station. The power lines still fed energy to the console report panel. It was a full-blown holocaust within the Earth. Power breaks everywhere, tunnels flooding, radiation hotspots already lethal to any unprotected personnel. Different parts of the reactor system were coming under more and more enormous pressure and collapsing. The pressure squeezed metal, and the steel shapes groaned and bent and finally exploded. The very system that had made this entire project safe, so they had predicted, had now become its own worst enemy. The vast water flows in the coiled and serpentine paths of the great pipelines recirculated heat with an efficiency constant several times greater than ever used before in any energy-producing complex. That was the way they had managed to create the largest nuclear energy plant in the world in complete secrecy. They'd told the outside world that the enormous electrical dynamos within the mountain harnessed huge underground rivers. Had they announced their decision to build a fast breeder reactor, even under a mountain, the project would never have seen the first stirring of construction, thanks to the anti-nuclear forces. So they had gone underground in more ways than one, and felt secure. Because what in the hell could be safer than a nuclear plant under a mountain? My God, they had billions of tons of shielding. Well, it had been one hell of a theory. Now it was collapsing under the awesome forces of a crunching earthquake and a mountain with severe stomach cramps. And when billions of tons of granite growl, man's machinery suffers the same acute indigestion and comes apart at the seams. Lance reached level E and stopped. He pushed everything from his mind. Breathe. Again, deeply and slowly. Let the adrenaline pump. That's it. The ringing in his ears subsided, and the tortured heaving of his chest eased to a normal pace of respiration. He looked blankly at another report console. Make immediate contact. The glowing letters blazed at him. He forced the fog from his mind and plugged the suit connector into the unit that connected him to Control Center. Static. Electrical hissing. No contact. Screw it. He unplugged and began another long, slanting ascent. The report console at level D repeated the same flashing request. Make immediate contact. He was moving more slowly now. God, he was tired. He looked at the rising radiation levels with stark dismay. They were going through a slow, murderous outward expulsion. He plugged in. To his surprise, he had immediate voice and television contact. On the screen before him, he saw Matterly's drawn face. A group of white-coated technicians, their faces wan and frightened, was visible behind him. "Lance, thank God you called in." Matterly sucked in air. His eyes were unnaturally wide. "Listen carefully, Lance. The reactor core is going through a meltdown, and it's a bad one. Worse than anything I've ever known. There's very little time. The rods have broken in the central core, and what we're getting is a severe crushing of material from the collapse of the heavy rock masses. Lance, we're getting a severe compression in the core." Lance Parker felt an icy wind through even the steaming heat of his suit. He wiped a gloved hand across the helmet visor to clear away some of the dust. What kind of nightmare was this? He was poised in a slanting ladder that ran straight down into hell, and... "I know it sounds impossible," Matterly's voice droned into Lance's brain, "but we're getting an extraordinary reaction, and... God damn it, wrap it up!" Lance spat. "We have a high fission reaction. It's breaking into loose." Lance stared at the television monitor. "Short and sweet, John. Is there an approach to the K factor?" The silence was just long enough to confirm the worst. "Yes, we have an open end of reaching critical mass." Jesus Christ. "The automatic controls have failed, and so have the remotes." John Matterly's words tumbled from him in a rush. "Lance, you've got to get into the reactor control center to the manual overrides. The only way we can save this whole situation is for you to set off the embedded charges and flood the core from the storage tanks. It'll blow apart the rods." "We'll get one hell of a radiation output," Lance said, and he realized his voice was literally a snarl. What the hell? They were talking about him being the hero, and that was so much crap. "But it's the only thing that'll work." Matterly's voice reached an almost waspish whine. He was frantic. "It will stop the rise towards K, and from that point we can contain what's already happened." Silence. The magic letter. K. K stands for critical factor. When there's enough uranium compressed to sufficient okay. We just can't read the word density today. Suffice it to say, boom, boom. When there's enough uranium compressed to a sufficient density and mass to transform a reactor into a fucking bomb. "You're not giving me much of a chance, John," he said finally. "I know, Lance. I know. Your chances are slim." "They stink." "But you're the only one who can do it. I've already started the rescue crews on their way to the core room. They'll work through from the A shaft." "Not a chance, John. It's a one-way trip for them." "We don't have much choice." He didn't have to say that Lance Parker had the choice. He could tell them to go screw and keep right on climbing to the surface. Lance, no one can or will blame you if you decide not to go back into that thing. Most people would call you every kind of fool for even trying. Lance heard a short, harsh laugh from his own mouth. Ha! Well, John, they say one fool begets another. You started this whole mess, and I was your golden-haired boy, so I guess we're fools of a feather. Look, I'll punch in as I go along, but I won't stop to chit-chat. He jerked the connection free. If he talked any more, he knew his own common sense would take over, and he would tell John Matterly to screw off. He twisted in the shaft and started his descent back into hell. Chapter 3. He fought against every tumbling second of time. The suit cooling system was on overload, and not even the cool oxygen could disguise from him the stink of his own sweat. And fear, he murmured to himself as he scrambled down the ladder to reach an escape shaft still sealed off from the choking water that had almost snared him. He didn't need the position consoles. The emergency system routing had been established firmly in his mind long before this moment. Indeed, he was responsible for the rule that every man who worked in Central Core had to memorize the emergency routes between the core control rooms and the exits to the outside world. Twice Lance had to stop in the smaller tunnels, where he had barely enough room to proceed in his cumbersome armor. He had taken alternate routes because the selected tunnel had suffered a breach, or had been crushed in the deep shuddering of the earthquake. Nevertheless, he moved steadily toward the core, noting, as he went, the continuing rise in radiation levels measured on wall monitors and through the instruments of his protective suit. The heaviest explosions were now a thing of the past, but there was no escaping the steady rumble transmitted to his feet, and the manner in which dust danced along the floor of the emergency tunnels, cavorting senselessly in the twin beams of his suit lights. At each station he passed, he paused long enough to bang his gloved fist against a wall signal stud to let Matterly and the others know both his progress and his position at any one time. No messages flashed at him to call in. They didn't have the time to waste in conversation. 40 minutes after he had abandoned his near reach to safety and started his return into the belly of the mountain, exhausted, eyes smarting from the salt of his own sweat, he stood before the crumpled metal door of the central control room. He could hardly believe what lay sprawled before him. In every direction, bodies sprawled awkwardly, frozen in their grotesque last moments of violent death, limbs twisted beneath torsos, eyes bulging as they were struck down in the midst of their fear. Strange, the door had been crumpled as if it were paper, but there was little physical damage within the master control proper. He scanned the boards. Whatever had happened here had swept through a peak and then subsided after performing its grisly mission. He stood before the videophone panel, punched in the emergency line to exterior control, and watched the anxious faces of John Matterly and his aides come to life on a flickering, ghostly screen. "Everybody here is dead," he said by way of salutation. "The main door's been torn apart, but not much damage inside. From the looks of things, we must have taken we from the looks of things, we took a tremendous electrical overload. It must have flashed out it must have flashed out of the equipment like ball lightning. Most of the people look as if they were hurled about and killed by shock at the same time." Matterly ignored the dead. "Have you got condition readout?" he asked without preamble. Lance scanned the gauges. "Looks like almost everything's on the line. On the line. Wow, okay. Looks like almost everything's on the line. Air circulation and cooling are gone, though. Immediate temperature in here is 170 degrees, and it's still climbing. That's 170. Even as he spoke the words, he knew Matterly understood the meaning of that temperature rise. "Lance, I know it's supposed to be impossible, but we're getting a fast reaction from that core. Do you agree with the compression effect?" Lance nodded to himself and looked up again. Oh, gosh. Lance nodded to himself and looked up again at the video screen. Only one thing, John. We've had a physical collapse into the chamber with the fuel rods. They've been jammed together by God knows how many thousand tons of rock, so what we have is the equivalent of plutonium being imploded, but on a greatly expanded time scale from a bomb. But what you're worried about is that if we get any farther collapse, we get a real crunch. Any further collapse, we get a real crunch, and the squeeze could give us a critical mass. I wish you were wrong, Matterly said. Shit, so do I. What about the computer evaluation? Matterly took a deep breath. We've been staying real-time with the computer. According to our electronic oracle, the pressure is still increasing, and in something like 20 minutes from now, we'll have so much squeeze the plutonium will begin uncontrolled fission. Big difference. Lance felt the icy wind again through his suit. No question on critical mass? It wasn't so much a question as a useless prayer. None. Give me the predicted yield. For a moment he saw John Matterly trying to speak, finally sucking in air to force out the words. The computer can give only variables, of course, Lance, and we don't know how many input circuits are still functioning, but... Jesus Christ, the numbers! Matterly swallowed. His answer was a solid kick to the mental groin, and it came in a staccato read-off of the numbers. Minimum yield 3 kilotons. Max yield curves off the graph at 54 kilotons. Lance's response was unexpected. Holy shit! That meant an explosion on the lowest side of the scale of 3,000 tons of high explosives, along with the accompanying shock waves and the jet-like release through the tunnel vents of some pretty nasty radioactivity. But that was the low side. If the computer slide-off was accurate in the opposite direction, then, as the core continued to compress under the grinding weight and pressure of the surrounding rock, they would have an explosion equal to that of 54,000 tons of TNT erupting in the bowels of the mountain. It was more than an explosion. A hell of a lot more. It was 3 times as powerful as that grim beauty they used to pulverize the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. My God, they had a city buster on their hands. The shock could trigger another earthquake in an already unstable situation, and the radioactive release would far exceed tunnel venting. It could be catastrophic on a scale all its own. The clock gave him all of 18 minutes to prevent the nuclear disaster. He knew what he must do, and without any further delay. He ignored Matterly's useless words. He turned from the video console and went back into the reactor master control room, stepping over and around bodies. A glance at the digital temperature readout didn't help. Since he'd walked into this area barely 5 or 10 minutes ago, the ambient temperature had climbed another 12 degrees. It was now 182 degrees Fahrenheit. Toasty! The goddamned chain reaction was beginning and pouring out enormous waves of heat. An energy reactor was being transformed into a bomb. It was that simple. And the instant it achieved the status of a bomb, it would explode. And he was the only poor, dedicated son of a bitch who might be able to slay the dragon in its nuclear nest. He punched the computer code before the steel blast doors to the emergency control room. The heavy door released its catches, and he had to tug with all his strength to open the steel mass. It grumbled on roller bearings as it slid slowly and ponderously aside. He pulled it closed behind him, and it thunked into position with a finality he didn't like at all. The spherical emergency control room was a tomb within a tomb of the mountain, a chamber sealed off from the outside world, near or distant, save for plug-in cables that would, once he activated the override controls, be snapped away by steel blades crashing into place. The great sphere was festooned in every direction, like a woman gone mad with hair curlers, with massive springs of the type used to shock mount enormous intercontinental ballistic missiles in their underground silos. With its honeycomb anti-crush material and other protective systems, the chamber was intended to withstand the force of any impact save that of a close hit with a nuclear warhead. Which was what was going to happen unless he quit this idiotic reflection of his and pulled all the right handles. He went through an elaborate cross-checking of trigger locks and had several more minutes of safety preparations to complete when a great gong sounded, and lights throughout the chamber began flashing. Bong! There could be no more waiting. The plutonium had now been squeezed together with such force that the fission process was getting out of hand. Critical mass could be only moments away. Lance threw himself into the master seat, a thickly padded seat built like an enormous throne, pulled restraints about his legs, arms, torso, and helmeted head, opened the cover to the ultimate button, and squeezed that button with one finger, while he pulled a spring-loaded toggle switch with another. He had to hold down both the button and the toggle for 12 seconds and not interrupt the electrical command from either during that period, or the final safety process would never go through. He counted down backward from 12 to 1, reached 0, was befuddled when nothing happened. He started to curse and never completed the thought. The world blew up in his face. Chapter 4. Shock waves, hard as steel, punched outward to blow apart critical control rods in vertical assemblies, severing rods, hurling them into a tangled mess like an enormous pipe organ tearing itself to jangling junk. The tubes of lead, so essential to damping the rise of heat and the rate of radioactive emission, were shredded and melted by the intense heat of the explosions. The radioactive outpouring flared in a mushrooming glow, but only for an instant, for as the intricate and finely balanced assembly became a boiling cauldron of lead, steel, plastic, and other debris, there remained no chance that the fission process taking place from imploding plutonium would continue. The dangerous runaway fission ended as swiftly as the blast tore it apart. Oh, ended as swiftly as the blast tore apart the concentrated mass. The explosion was everything it had been designed to be. Nevertheless, a great dragon simmered and writhed in the midst of the shattered nuclear cornucopia, and its name was radioactivity. Within the massive spherical shell of his survival chamber, Lance Parker was unaffected by alpha and beta particles. They could not penetrate the layered sludge born of the contrived devastation. But there were gamma rays and neutrons that could slice through the miasma of boiling rock and magma as if it were little more than wisps of fog. The gamma rays flashed outward, ghosted through rock and steel and glass and the body of Lance Parker, doing their cruel damage to his organs and body systems and bones and eyes. Then they were gone, and their presence remained only as a legacy of physiological disaster. The neutrons had the ability to render other objects radioactive. When the blast itself was spent and the Earth was grumbling under the job of settling its unequal pressures, the effect of the neutrons remained. Much of what existed about Lance had been rendered radioactive, thereby continuing the radioactivity affecting him and beginning a deadly cumulative effect. The breakdown was as insidious as it was dangerous, for Lance Parker felt nothing of its effects. Yet. Lance was occupied with utter matters, loud, physical. The explosive shock, the explosive shock, lose your page and everything goes to heck in a handbasket. The explosive shock ripping through the dense material surrounding the reactor core had rattled him in his seat like a helpless spastic undergoing a jolt of electricity. Phrasing? He could feel the liquid sloshing in his body. That's a bad sign.
Maybe he just drank a lot of water that he didn't sweat out. He's hungry, too, as we heard from the groans before. Slishy sloshy.
He shook, palsied, jerked wildly to and fro within the securing harness of his seat, and finally realized the punishing ride was over when his vision began to clear. He sat quietly for several minutes and tried to take stock. The chamber had retained its structural integrity. That meant he had to propel air and pressure and temperature control. That meant he had proper air and pressure and temperature control, and the complicated life support systems were functioning. He had a decent chance to remain alive there for weeks to come, if that bleak prospect were to be realized. And despite the head-rattling and body-sloshing punishment of the explosion, he had no more injuries worth any worry. What he must do, he realized, was to understand just where he was and what his relationship was to the outside world and the future. His power systems were self-contained. Fuel cells and batteries, no sweat on these. He existed in what was the perfect equivalent of a spaceship. Self-regulating temperature, humidity, and pressure systems. He had scrubbers that would clean his lung exhalations, that would literally eat carbon dioxide and water vapor exactly like the systems in an Apollo spacecraft. Fans would circulate and recirculate the air. His body wastes and other debris would be dropped into a deep receptacle beneath the chamber floor, sealed and then instantly ionized by a short-lived but intense electromagnetic flash. Even feces converted instantly to free molecules aren't Even feces converted instantly to free molecules aren't a bother. He had food and water and medications but no communication with the outside world. If he had been claustrophobic, he would have long since been foaming at the mouth. All cables leading to and from the chamber had been severed just before the deliberate explosion. Face it, you're locked inside a mountain. Buried, impounded, sealed, imprisoned, trapped, wedged, whatever the hell you want to call it. And there's no way out. They will have to come to me. But he had no way of knowing how extensive the damage was from the explosion he'd triggered. If he had collapsed the tunnels and shafts leading to the chamber, just what access the rescue teams had. Or didn't have. Yet time was against him. The longer he remained in this chamber, the fewer were his chances for survival. The radiation would continue to work its deadly effect on his body systems, and the greatest of all dangers lay in radiative accretion, the cumulative effect. Cumulative effect. Sorry. I'm slurring my speech. I shouldn't be doing that. I try to enunciate clearly. Sometimes it doesn't work. It doesn't help when my sinuses are clogged because it throws off the shape of my skull, basically. So everything I expect to be doing doesn't do. Anyway, he laughed aloud at the absurdity of it all. Huh! Now that the radiation levels were no longer immediately lethal, he would be trickled to death by accumulation. Yes, it says trickled. Yeah, okay, that's right, fine. He sighed, released the seat restraints, and stood upright. There was no need to wear his suit of dusty armor anymore. You sure? He studied the control panel and set all contact alarms to their maximum sensitivity. There was always the chance that Matterly and the rescue teams would deliberately set off a series of minor explosive shocks in a coded number to let him know they were on their way.
It's Morse code, using boom booms.
He rechecked all the life support systems, made a mental checklist of what to scan and service every 4 hours, and was astonished to discover that despite the reality of his imprisonment and the great likelihood of his death, he was hungry. Yeah, 'cause your stomach groaned earlier. You heard it. Sure, it could have also been the explosion/earthquake, but
he was hungry.
He turned on a cassette player to fill the dull acoustic atmosphere of the chamber with music, swung down a sleeping cot from the curving sidewall behind him, inflated the mattress, and poured through the food stores. 10 minutes later, thanks to his auto-electric food heater system, he was having a bowl of mulligan stew, fresh crackers, hot tea, and fruitcake. The only thing missing was a good cigar, but tobacco had never entered the list of survival rations. He leaned back, belched, scratched himself comfortably, and pondered the reading library. But he couldn't concentrate on a book while all about him there prowled a radioactive monster. He had a better way. Oh, right. He was an expert self-hypnotist, thanks to the technique he had developed years before to aid his engineering studies, improve his relaxation, and even be able to listen to recorded lessons while in a hypnotism-induced sleep state. Never had he been more grateful for that ability. He knew he could slip away into a world of self-mesmerization and yet be sufficiently alert to snap back to unpleasant reality if that were necessary. Close your eyes. Relax. That's it, just let it all go. Let's start down now. 100, 99, 98. You're starting to float down, a deep and long descent, wafting downward like a feather. Down, down. 97. As you float down, you will drift off into a state of complete relaxation. Easy, easy, floating, drifting. 96. Floating. Chapter 5. Oh, you aren't asleep yet? Sorry. I could have kept going. I mean, that's all it said, but I've done the hypnotism thing. It works. I mean, it is a thing.
Get some good nap time in.
He was still Chapter 5. He was still accelerating as the jump plane flashed up and away from him. He held out his arms and extended his legs in jump position, and then, from all the sensory inputs of wind and sound and the way his body reacted even to so much as a palm, flashed upward or down. Oh, okay. Sorry. He held out his arms and extended his legs in jump position, and then, from all the sensory inputs of wind and sound and the way his body reacted, even to so much as a palm flashed upward or downward, he knew he was at a flat-bodied terminal velocity. He maneuvered his limbs to turn slightly. "Hey, over here!
Over here,
He heard. Even with the wind tearing past him and the jump helmet, he recognized Lee Grazzie's voice. Grazzi. It's Grazzi. Grazzi. I don't know. There weren't that many beautiful women with crystal laughter in their tone. His body turned slowly, and they maneuvered closer, grinning at one another. Wisps of dark hair fluttered from the sides of her helmet. He had never seen anything so beautiful in his life. Even within that wind-tugged jumpsuit and helmet and goggles, there was no way to mistake this woman he loved. They touched hands, a light caress as they fell earthward, two human forms floating under perfect control. Their world above a world was a feather-bed of infinite softness. She pushed away, laughing, and quickly she pulled her knees up to her chest, and he did the same, and they rolled through a lyrical somersault, then spread-eagled again. Lance moved his palms outward and slid backward and away from Lee. She nodded. Time fled swiftly in these carefree leaps through thin but friendly air. The trick was to engage that massive planet below them with gentle greeting. They grasped the D-rings of their main chutes and pulled. A spring snapped away a small pilot chute that blossomed instantly and whipped away. They could hear the fluting whistle of rubber bands, an easy, gentle shuddering sound as the shroud lines followed the pilot chute away, filled quickly but also gently, and that quickly their fall was ended. And they floated like great nylon dandelions, wafting toward Earth. 84, 83, 82, floating, falling gently, drifting down. Lee came off the high board with flawless grace, her body shamefully sinuous as she arched at the high curve of her dive, twisting through and head coming down. She sliced into the clear waters of the pool with no more splash than a cavorting silent dolphin. I mean, they can splash a lot. Sorry. She came out of the water, and he greeted her with a wild hug, and they laughed together. "You're getting your clothes all wet," she protested, pushing him back gently. He hugged her all the tighter. Who cared about getting wet, or the clothes, or all the smiling people watching them and laughing with them? He kissed her deeply. 77, 76, floating, floating. Their clothes seemed to slide from their bodies, not all at once, but piece by piece, in between sweet kisses and deep embraces, until only their skin and souls came together. They joined and they moved in love, and it was complete. And he soared into a gut-wrenching climax, and floated along a lofty cloud, and the wild surging of his loins became gentle warmth, and he eased down slowly, floating back to physical touch, floating down gently, ever so gently. 63, 62, 61. Hiking along high mountain trails, joining the sharp-hooved and sure-footed creatures that pranced and leaped along jagged rocks, tugging and struggling to crags and ultimate peaks, and coming down slowly, carefully, linked together by strong safety lines, bound even stronger by what passed between their minds. 57, 56. Lance looked down from the weathered balcony of their apartment on a high hill overlooking San Francisco Bay. Even in the shimmering distance, a floating Camelot in the foggy haze of San Francisco, rose lofty spires and needles of buildings. He glanced at the winding road to see a bright yellow MGB curling its path upward, saw that flowing dark hair of Lee, felt again that sense of miracle, luxuriated in the feeling of love and oneness that always rose so quietly in him. She had worked late in her laboratory. Lance was home early from his gleaming chrome and plastic and electronic environs of Coastal Dynamics, where he labored to produce new designs and machinery for the great power systems that might slake a nation's insatiable demands for energy. He was a chemist and a nuclear engineer and an aerodynamicist, and he had his Ph.D. in fluid mechanics, all of which seemed to contradict his athletic prowess and competitive spirit. But at least he and a friend owned a twin-engine plane, and he and Lee owned a boat and a sumptuous van. 32 years old, nearly 6 feet tall, with curly brown hair and 190 pounds of muscle and sinew on his frame, he appeared more the star slugger of a major league team than the young scientist. He had been called brilliant and innovative by his colleagues, but those were the words he reserved for the slim, dark-haired beauty who was driving to him now. In her chosen field she was considered just one short step over the boundaries of genius. He thought now, as he often did, of how much she had achieved already. Lee had begun her college studies in medicine and physiology, added bionics and cybernetics to her learning burdens, and then judged accurately that she was sorely deficient in human engineering systems and electronics. So she had learned and taught herself as much as, if not more than, had been provided her through her skull-squeezing years at MIT and UCLA. Lee Grazzi had put into her career future the same incisive judgment that had marked her academic years. There existed a wide-open market for a new commodity, and Lee swiftly stepped into the vacuum. Produced and patented what she called her AHS, Automated Human System. Her robot figures were indistinguishable from living persons. They were built with such detailed systems that they could bend, twist, rotate, rise, sit, stand, and, for the limited distances of entertainment dioramas, even walk and execute a series of commands imprinted within their computers.
She developed artificial larynx systems that gave individual voices to her near androids, as she was so fond of calling them, and the Grazi dioramas became the rage of the entertainment and industrial demonstration worlds. They were so startlingly real that technical industry bought them for special tests with cars and aircraft, and 100 other uses, and Lee became a woman who could have rapidly grown wealthy had she not found so much pleasure in pouring the incoming finances right back into new and ever more advanced research. For if Lee found any real pleasure in any endeavor, it was in the challenge of improving what lay behind her. Prosthetics and exoskeletal systems and modifications of computers with their silicon chips jammed with the memories of motions of living human beings. She was the creator of modern age benevolent and faithful Frankensteins. Monsters. Frankenstein's monsters. And she searched, it doesn't say monsters, it just says Frankenstein's. We can't all have read Frankenstein or be currently reading it on our stream. And she searched constantly for plastiskin with human hair embedded in the material. She perfected artificial eyes that narrowed and enlarged their pupils, and she gave those eyes tear ducts with saline solutions. Her automated human systems were near androids that might slide across the invisible barrier to real life if only she could brew up a new stirring of electrical juices. He thought of the elaborate hoax she had played on him one night he had returned from a trip to find her standing behind the bar of their Sausalito hillside apartment. He had started toward her for an embrace and a kiss when she extended her hand. "No, don't. Not yet, Lance. Let me bring a drink to you first. Take the couch, please." He had studied her in the half light of the apartment, then nodded. Lee was unpredictable in her moods at such moments, and he enjoyed yielding to her desires. He had watched her lithe movements as she brought the drink to him. Ordinarily, she wore no clothes when they were alone late at night. She slept in the buff, and so he was surprised, but in some different way quite pleased, when he saw the outline of that lovely form beneath a brief, sheer nightie. She slid close to him on the seat and extended his drink. "Welcome home, darling." He had held the drink. God, she'd never been more beautiful, more sensuous than at this moment, and he waited to drink, leaning closer to her, their lips touching. She fell into his lap. He was so astonished as she collapsed across him that the drink tumbled from his hand, and he blinked as the room lights snapped on full and Lee stood before him. "Damn it, I thought I had that balance problem licked. But when the torso bends like that on a soft surface, the center of gravity shifts and—" She had stood before him and sighed. "Hi, I love you. Do you like your welcome home present?" The human facsimile had lain warm and gurgling in his lap, and he stared up at her. "I don't know whether to kill you or love you," he said finally. He looked morosely at the spilled drink. "Was that real? Ashamed to waste it." "Kiss me and I'll make you another. And close your jaw, love. Did I really surprise you that much?" He had refused to kiss her until the ersatz Lee, still warm and still gurgling his name, was dragged off to a closet and its power systems were disconnected. He shuddered. "I still don't believe it." So, there'll be more like that. You'll notice certain charged language used. Oh, there'll be more. 44, 43, 42. Down, down. He handed her a drink as she came through the door, easing packages onto the couch. She held the drink and kissed him warmly, then saluted him with her glass. "I detect all manner of bubbling sounds and strange pleasant smells from the kitchen. Do I hasten or lie here like a smiling wastrel?" He grinned at her. "Waste away, lovely one. This evening is my once-a-month plunge into gastronomical adventures. You sit and sip, and then we both sup." She chewed the end of an olive with glistening white teeth. During the time of your last such adventure, she purred, I recall fervent prayers of thanks from both of us that this place has 2 bathrooms.
Lance winced. "A slight miscalculation, my dear."
A vast dumping of the wrong spices, as I remember it.
"The wrong time of the moon, weak stomachs and all that."
Mine wasn't weak before you cooked.
She joined him in the kitchen and nibbled at his earlobe.
All right, living dangerously is fun, I suppose.
He sniffed with mock disdain. "You'd rather jump from an airplane?"
At least that doesn't upset my stomach. What do you boil in your toil for us, lover?
"Ah, an ancient recipe from the witches who ghost through forests, from their friends and trolls, from the elves and the creatures that go bump in the night. It is what I call a challenge recipe."
She studied him, holding back her smile. You pique my interest. I didn't know you were a warlock.
"Only in the intestinal sense, my dear."
You sound like Dracula with a belly fetish. What's the challenge?
"You can't—"
No, wait, she interrupted hurriedly. First tell me what it's called.
"Chicken nuggets." The silence held for a long moment.
Chickens don't have nuggets. Roosters may, but I really haven't looked lately.
"Chicken nuggets, damn it!" he repeated.
All right, she sighed. My interest is yours. What's the challenge with your foul testicles?
That's Fowl, by the way. It's a pun, a pun, a play on words. "I'll ignore that if you pay attention," he rebuked her.
Horrors. I promise good manners from here on. The challenge, Mr. Parker. Tell me.
He showed the trace of a smile. "The recipe is from my grandmother. If you're with me while I prepare the meal, there's no way you'll eat a full dinner at the table.
Why?
Once you start tasting, you can't quit. You munch your way through. No way to stop."
You mean I can't just take one bite?
Oh, there's no question mark there.
You mean I can't take just one bite?
That's it.
I don't believe it.
You get the wine, we drink while we cook.
We drink and you cook.
He rolled his eyes. You test your chef.
The better to observe.
She looked about the kitchen.
This is all preparation, or has the ship been launched?
I have waited patiently for your return. Now, first, I beat 2 eggs with a whisk in a bowl of precisely 2½ quarts capacity, and then—
Do you know how to make a Hungarian omelet? You're on your way. First, you steal 2 eggs and—
Shut up. You whisk the eggs for 1 minute until they are a precise golden yellow. Presto, we add 1 cup of water, 1½ teaspoons of salt, 2 tablespoons of sesame seeds.
Yuck.
He ignored the barbs and swept on. "And 1 cup of flour measured precisely. We mix thoroughly until the flour is mixed into the proper batter. Ah, just right." He moved the bowl aside, moved another large bowl before them. "These shall become nuggets."
My God, you've chopped the chicken.
She drank a bit more hastily. "Of course, my love. 8 chicken breasts into cubes of approximately 1 inch size." She waved an empty glass before working on a refill.
You, my engineer of micromillimeters, are saying approximately? Why not precisely?
"Dead chickens, yet uncooked, squiggle like sponges."
I yield the point. Continue.
"We use these handy tongs here to dip the chicken cubes in the batter. Over here you will note I have been preparing 1½ pints of oil within a 3-quart Corningware cooking pot."
Uh-huh.
She sipped noisily. "This goes on for some time, so you weren't ready for a chicken nuggets recipe, but you're getting one." I needed this, I think. Now we cook the nuggets until they become a fascinating golden brown in color. The stove is on medium heat. The level of oil is precise, so we shall cook for 4 minutes." He moved quickly to another bowl. "Here we have the sauce, into which I have combined 1 cup catsup, 1/2 teaspoon dry mustard, 1 tablespoon of brown sugar, 6 tablespoons of margarine."
You've got to be kidding. And make that 2 tablespoons of vinegar. We cook over medium heat in a saucepan for 5 minutes. I don't know about the margarine, but the rest of that sounds legit. We cook over medium heat in a saucepan for 5 minutes, stirring constantly with the left hand until it is a dark russet to red in color. She blinked her eyes. Russet? And why the left hand? Oh, I see. You're playing catch-up. Stir with the left hand and use the tongs with your right hand to remove the nuggets. What happens if you want to scratch your nose? He ignored her as he removed the first cooked chicken nuggets and placed them on a paper towel. His left hand kept stirring, and with his right hand he placed more chicken cubes in the pot. He grinned at her. The sauce isn't set. Watch that chicken. It's hot, so don't burn yourself. She picked up one with extra caution, bit gingerly, showed surprise, moved it from one hand to the other. Like I said, hot, he warned again. My God, it's delicious. All that witch's brew. She reached for a second piece. I can't believe it. Try the sauce, he smirked. Too hot yet. I'll wait. I'll just try one more. He laughed. Uh-huh, I told you. She tried to talk through a mouthful of hot chicken nugget. I told you, you can't eat just one. You keep eating these damn things fast as I make 'em. Pour me a nice triple martini, will you? I'm a prisoner in my own kitchen. Sure thing. Here. 30 minutes later, they were both stuffed and more than well on their way to being smashed. They giggled and sat on the kitchen floor, mixing nuggets with martinis. Lance sprawled on the floor. I'm horny, Lee said. I'm stuffed. Call for help. She undid his belt. Help, she said quietly. My God, I'd die. She pulled away his clothes. What a way to go. You lie still, slaving over a hot stove and all that. Her clothes tumbled by his. She wriggled her toes. Nice and cool. Lie still, damn it. She slid onto him, leaned forward to grasp his hair with both hands, and kissed him deeply. He couldn't move. He was a giant bowl of contentment as she took him at her own leisure, and he nearly went mad as she brought them both to climax. She lay beside him, her head nestled in the crook of his arm, instantly asleep. He felt himself drifting away, drifting down, down. 30, 29, 28. The small boat drifted through Stygian darkness, floating with the black current beneath them. They were awed, enchanted, as their lights moved across the miniature cathedral spires of the deep cave. The colors, she spoke in a half whisper. I don't really believe the colors. Where could they come from? There's no sun down here. She flicked him a glance. And don't start reeling off your list of elements and chemicals. I'd rather be a kid again in fairyland. He smiled. That you are. That we both are. She turned her head suddenly. What's that sound? It sounds like thunder, but it can't be that. He flashed a light on the water, watched it swirling by the boat. We're moving faster. It could be a waterfall. Then we'd better put on the brakes. He turned his light again to the narrowing tunnel before them. Sparkling motes drifted downward. The thunder became louder, and now they felt vibrations in the air and through the water. Lee had time only to cry out, Lance! When the thunder became a terrible roar, and the world began to pulverize its own innards, and rocks fell into the river, and the cave was collapsing all about them, and a wave capsized the boat, and the icy water struck him with the shock of a billion frozen needles, and he felt himself going under, going down, down, down. 19, 18, 17. Wake up, you dumb son of a bitch! Come out of it! His own voice, his subconscious, screaming at him. The built-in warning at the back of his mind. He blinked his eyes, startled, moving only his eyes, and oh, Jesus, the world was coming apart all about him. Just outside the surface of his spherical chamber, enormous rock masses were shifting. Alarms clamored shrilly in his ears because not even the incredible strength of the sphere could endure that kind of pressure without breaching its integrity, and when that happened, his air would become heated radioactive fog. Christ, man, move it! He was moving immediately to where he'd hung up his armored survival suit, and he was closed in, completing the pressurization and power systems, when he heard a devastating twang. That's capital letters with an exclamation point. Twang! The cry of a bowstring a mile long releasing its energy. And he heard it again, and even in the face of certain death he marveled at the sound that he knew no man had ever heard before, those massive springs coming apart under unbelievable pressure, and he clambered into the seat and tugged all the straps and the restraints as tightly as they would go. He stared at the spherical wall as it rocked violently, and when the blurring eased, he saw the first spidery cracks appearing, and as the suit cooling system kicked in, you could almost feel the awesome heat. A crack widened into a true fissure, and the edges of some enormous boulder punched through what had become an eggshell, and the rough-edged rock ground inexorably toward him, and slowly, deliberately, as if the pushing finger of some angry deity, broke his leg once, twice, and still a third time, and the sweat stabbed in agony from his face, and he felt the heat coming through the crushed suit. Shit, why die like this? He could at least go without thrashing about mindlessly like a creature burning alive while all those granite teeth were closing on him. He found the control for the morphine syringe and stabbed it wildly, felt the drug sluice into his system, and he stabbed a second one, and a third, and it was a race between powerful opiates and the maddening pain, and then the pain came from a distance, and he wasn't all that sure it was his pain, and he really didn't care anymore. He heard the roar again, the roar he'd heard in the river with Lee, but when had they died in that river? The sound was the same, an angry mountain collapsing upon itself, a paroxysm of final convulsion, and there, over there, another crack in the eggshell, and he saw a steel-hard jet of water, under all that pressure, rip into the chamber, as straight and true as if it were a steel rod, and it came at him. He tried to move his head out of the way, but he didn't care, and it missed his head anyway, and he knew someone was grinding a knife into his shoulder, and he fell faster and faster into a black whirlpool, and he knew he was thinking his last, his final thought. Thank God, I'm dead. Chapter 6. He has an even chance, no more, no less. Dr. Martha Foster held Lance Parker's chart. She turned to look directly at the distraught face of Lee Grazzi.
50-50, Lee intoned. Not much of a chance, is it?
No question there. Statement. Announcement of almost certain death. The physical injuries were only part of it. Lee looked up through the thick glass window separating her from the hyperbaric chamber that had, for nearly 3 months, contained the broken, abused, even savaged form of Lance Parker. 3 months during which broken bones refused stubbornly to knit together. 3 months of almost constant struggle between a body that had quit long before and the miraculous tools and weapons and knowledge of modern medical science. Dr. Foster shook her head.
How can I discuss this with you on a medical basis? That's not a patient in there. It's a man you love. You're too deeply involved on an emotional basis to...
Lee's head snapped around to lock eyes with the doctor.
After all this time, you're not emotionally involved?
Martha Foster sighed again, held her hands clasped before her.
Of course I am. Very deeply. Let's just say I have more experience in that twilight zone between life and death. And the most important thing for you to remember, for all of us to remember, is that we're not using machinery to keep him alive. Lance isn't a vegetable. He's been hurt in the cruelest way. But the very fact that he's alive is a great victory. If this were 30 years ago, perhaps even 10, he would have died. Not from the physical injuries, the radiation. We know so much more now.
She looked through the window into the chamber where they had kept Lance under an atmospheric pressure of 30 pounds per square inch, double that of normal, and with the oxygen content at 55% instead of the normal 21%. Oxygen under pressure to saturate tissues that couldn't receive enough oxygen because the blood cells didn't work well, because the blood didn't work well, because too many cells of too many kinds were missing, because the circulation system was a physiological plumbing nightmare, and
How could he have lived through it all? Any other man would be dead. Any sane man would have quit, would have pulled the switch inside his own mind. But he hasn't. He doesn't know what's happened to him. If he did, he would have willed himself to die. If only we can keep him alive long enough to gain his strength, he may not be able to close off his mind to life. He may live despite himself.
Lee Grazzi forced down the lump in her throat. It had been there too many times. She had even learned to close off the tears, even in the darkness of her lonely bedroom at night, even when she lived in her own imagination. What had happened to Lance deep under that mountain? Right ankle crushed, right leg fractured, left leg fractured, pelvis partially crushed, 7 ribs broken, organs damaged, healing slow, dangerous. Large intestine pierced. It had bled for 2 months. Right collarbone broken. 2 vertebrae crushed. Left side of the skull fractured. Concussion. Left arm broken in 3 places. Right wrist fractured. Lance was a complete medical catastrophe of broken bones, crushed bones, burned skin, punctures, abrasions, massive bruises, mashed capillaries, severed arteries and veins, thermal exhaustion, chemical burns, lung damage from inhalation of poisonous gases, damage to the retinal structure of one eye, still possible loss of hearing, and disfigurement, bodily distortion, scarred skin. A host of wonders awaited life for what had been a superb physical specimen. Would Lance hate her when he emerged from the fog in which electrically induced sleep had shrouded his ability to think? He was a maze before her eyes, a slowly pulsating biological mass with tubes and lines and wires running from and into and through his body, and connected to row after row of life-supporting machines. Electronic and mechanical angels ministering life. An artificial heart kept blood and oxygen moving until electrical shock and chemical stimulants could bring the weary, abused human heart to resume its nearly impossible task. Wires fed electrical impulses through his system. A kidney machine dribbled away wastes. He did not lie in bed. His body could never have taken that. He lay suspended in a sutured net that constantly shifted the weight and the pressure of his ravaged body. Bed sores alone could kill him. For the worst damage had been invisible, not in its effects, but in its cause. Those unseen sprays of radiation, gamma radiation and X-rays and neutrons and all the hellish fury they had wreaked in his unconscious form. He had been unconscious, trapped, still mind-isolated through the morphine and the shock to his own system when they had reached him. A paramedic had drowned him in opiates so that they could ease his form, like the skin of a cat with every bone inside broken. They could feel and hear his insides grinding and moving, his bodily liquids sloshing. Out of the smashed spherical chamber, and on that long, terrible ascent through the broken tunnels and shafts to the outside world. Plasma and IV and oxygen and adrenaline and anything else they had in the medevac helicopter, even a machine to pulsate the heart with electrical shocks timed to his heartbeat, and a steady flight directly to the great hospital on the outskirts of Oakland, where they placed him in the hyperbaric chamber and suspended him like a breathing, slowly heaving mass of bloody meat, and stuck in the lines and hoses and wires and... The radiation should have killed him. Lee felt a harsh and grating laughter in her own mind. Should have? It did. Twice, maybe 3 times. Invisible, insidious, horrifying, defying the struggle to live. He vomited again and again, and they had to be with him constantly so he wouldn't suffocate on the vomitus and bile that clogged his throat and threatened to add even more liquid to his already treacherous lungs. He lay unconscious, and the only thing they could bring within his body had to come via tube and needle. Glucose through a constant slow feed. Massive injections of vitamins and minerals and iron and God knew what else. And a small river of antibiotics. It was a time for knuckle-biting, hellish frustration when diarrhea racked that already crushed and mauled body, when the insidious effects of the ionizing radiation began to manifest themselves. There was no way to hold back the bilious upheavals or the diarrhea and the raw and bleeding surfaces of his mouth and throat. The bed would have been worse, but the sutured net itself was a special torment. Any surface against that outraged skin would have been terrible, creating bleeding beneath the skin. Okay, jeez. Sorry to anybody listening to this in the car, but it's siren o'clock. Uh, Any surface against that outraged skin would have been terrible, creating bleeding beneath the skin. He had been flayed and cut and lacerated and scraped and bruised. But he had been strong, powerful, in perfect physical condition, and they knew gratitude those first few days when healing signs showed quickly and scabs formed, and they knew his body was fighting its own battle, and very well indeed. Then the radiation emerged through tissue and liquids and bones and organs, and the scabs sloughed off and away, and wounds that were almost healed and already forming scars turned to mush before their eyes and bled freely. His eyes stared sightlessly from huge red pools because his retinas had begun to hemorrhage. His fever went wild, and they could not bathe him in ice water or alcohol or whatever, and they dared not fill him with aspirin or its equivalents because his blood refused to clot, and even aspirin could have killed him. Fans. Old-fashioned fans saved his life against the raging fever. Hanging, suspended through his benevolent meat-hook-like sutures, the fans could blow air about and around and across the tortured living carcass and carry away much of the heat and cool the skin. Several weeks after he had been sealed within the hyperbaric chamber, they almost lost him, when, unseen and unnoticed by them, the lining of his mouth and throat began to disintegrate and slough off into spongy, mushy clumps of material that almost choked him to death. A spasmodic coughing alerted them, and the very act of coughing nearly killed him. It was a bizarre and brain-rattling catch-22. To save him from one immediate stab of death, the cure itself could be lethal. They continued to balance along that razor-thin tightrope of survival and final utter collapse. "It's as if he's suffering from a terrible internal sunburn," Dr. Martha Foster explained to Lee Grazzi. "It burns not only the undersurface of the skin, but also the tissues of his entire body. The worst of it, of course, is that the ionizing radiation has such a devastating effect against the blood-making cells at the center of the long bones of the leg." Of course. Lee already knew that. Of course. Lee already knew that. She had spent sleepless nights studying the effects of ionizing radiation on the human body. She had crawled back in time to those hours and days after the suns stabbed into existence over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Lance suffered much the same as those Japanese who were in the open in the Japanese cities anviled by the early atomic bombs, with the exception that he was spared the thermal outpouring that would have burned him to a crisp. What drove her mad was that Lance was showing all the symptoms of final decay of those victims in Hiroshima and Nagasaki who had died. Why, then, did he live? The answer lay, of course, in his own superb physical condition. That, plus the fact that the medical staff did not grope blindly amidst the horrendous thickets of radiation damage. Thousands had been there before Lance Parker, and their deaths had at least built up a working knowledge of what ravaged his body. There was no guesswork anymore, since the doctors could anticipate, they could also plan their steps well ahead of time. They knew he would lose between 60 and 90% of all his white blood cells. They protected him with antibiotics and massive transfusions. They knew skin would deteriorate and mucous membranes would manifest acute inflammation, and they were ready with the necessary steps to ward off final disaster from that route. They prepared for the onslaught of inflammation of his gums, mouth, and pharynx. They were ready with cooling air when his fever rose. They could only hope that both their attention and his strength would fight off the temporary ulceration of his lower gastrointestinal tract. Temporary. Lance had broken several teeth years earlier in a bad fall from a mountain climbing accident. Dr. Martha Foster pondered that matter, and then memory rang a bell. She had the gold fillings removed at once from his mouth. He took neutron exposure, she explained to Lee. The damned gold is radioactive. It could have killed him. Any small straw could break the back of his remaining tenuous thread of life. The slightest cold, an onslaught of sneezing, could now kill Lance Parker. His survival was a race against time. Just how swiftly and effectively his doctors could keep fresh blood pumping into his veins with the white cells he needed to combat infection. The score so far was a tenuous standoff. The ionizing radiation, that superinternal sunburn, not only had wrecked his ability to produce white cells, but had also wreaked havoc on the ability of Lance's blood to coagulate. Wrecked and reeked are right on top of each other.
I just want to say it's not entirely my fault. Okay, thanks.
Thus, the internal bleeding. Even if the condition was temporary, it was impossible to escape the grim reality that the gamma radiation Lance had absorbed reduced drastically the number of platelets in his blood. Whoops. Again, it was the source of reproduction that took the beating, the bone marrow, now suffering the equal of terrible tiny furnaces raging through their roots. Platelets, so small, so insignificant, so essential to life. Tiny cellular protein bodies that played so indispensable a role in clotting tiny wounds in the capillaries and the smaller blood vessels. Scratch a man and watch him bleed to death.
God damn it, the man was Lance.
The pumping system was breaking down inside the biological machinery of one Lance Parker. But by some miracle, the crushing of his rib cage, the damage to his lungs, all the grueling knives of injury, had somehow escaped directly punishing his heart. Lee sat up brooding one sleepless night, trying to reduce her own emotion-racked heart to vital statistics by which she might anticipate the survival of the man she loved. Strange, but statistical parity helped. She could, in those times, think of Lance much as she did of her automated human systems, except that she dabbled with a biological computer in terms few people ever realized epitomized their own bodies. Blood. Heavier than water, half plasma and half corpuscles, 3 times the viscosity of water. A body with the mass of Lance Parker should contain some 13 pints. Easy numbers. She nibbled at the computer and brooded at numbers. She already knew the hellish drought of white cells and Lance's ghastly helplessness before infection and disease. Forget it, she told herself. They've got the machinery and the drugs and the systems to make up for that. She studied the other side of the coin, red and rich. Supposed to be red and rich, she mused. The lack of red was as potentially lethal to Lance as was the drought of white. Blood is red. Only if it's flowing through that miraculous circulation system. Only then. Don't forget that, she remembered. If you take a quart jar of blood, remove its ability to clot so it loses ability to retain color, you also change red to a triple agent in the jar. That wonderful red color plops to the bottom of the jar. Atop the wonderful red color, like icing on some liquid cake, is a thinly sliced layer of white. Those white corpuscles. In Lance's case, they were so few that if the jar had been filled from his body, the thin layer might not even have been visible, except for the slightest discoloration. Anyway, what about the top of the jar? Slightly more than half will be colored like straw. That's the plasma. Forget the plasma. That's right. There's no shortage. The hospital has pints, quarts, gallons, whole vats of the stuff, and most of it has already been in and through Lance. Life would remain, or it would ebb away into cold and gray meat if that rich, heavy liquid weren't replenished sooner or later by Lance's own systems. For now, the scientific biomedical machinery would suffice, but only for now. After that, the astonishing miracle of his own body must repair itself and resume its miracle of output, or he would wind down like a spongy clock choking on itself. She stared at her own hand, picked up a needle, and pricked her thumb. Lightly, just enough to produce a dot of blood. She adjudged it as being a cubic millimeter, the same size to which she and Dr. Foster had referred when they discussed the white blood cells that Lance needed so desperately and that had thinned to fog. One pinprick, 1 cubic millimeter, and a respective average of 7,000 to 8,000 white blood cells. A few snowflakes in an otherwise clear sky, compared to the blizzard of red to be produced continually, all his life, by his own body systems. She tapped the computer keys to study the digital readout displayed before her. Wonderful, life reduced to digits. But they were astonishing. 1 pinprick equals 8,000 white blood cells. 1 pinprick, the same one, equals 250,000 platelets. Platelets kept a man from bleeding to death from a scratch. They did other wonderful things, but she ignored that for the moment. 1 pinprick, the same one, also contained for a body the size of Lance Parker on the order of 5 million red corpuscles. More numbers. Lance had 13 pints of blood coursing through his body. That meant about 65 billion white blood cells, more than 1.5 trillion platelets, and some 35 trillion red cells. The red lived longer than the white, perhaps 4 months. Lance had been in that triple-damned hyperbaric chamber for 4 months, during which his blood had circulated throughout his body more than 170,000 complete round trips. To stay alive and reasonably healthy, 9 ounces of bone marrow from his entire system had to replace 20 billion red cells every single day. Every minute of every day, his heart shoved and pushed and pumped 27 trillion cells and platelets through his mauled body. The distribution system was all screwed up as well, and the heart and the body, understandably, had more than once simply wanted to quit. But the circulation had to be maintained, for the red cells were chock full of dandy little things that made up hemoglobin, and hemoglobin is the magic voyager that distributes oxygen throughout the body tissues. Lance desperately lacked hemoglobin, so he desperately lacked oxygen, and without the hyperbaric chamber and oxygen saturation and the machines and pumps and vats of blood and doctors and nurses and technicians, he would have... Don't say it. Right. let's stay with the numbers. Let's pick out one lonely little red corpuscle. Just one out of 35 trillion. That one corpuscle, she jabbed into the computer for the digital readout on the screen, carries nearly 300 million molecules of hemoglobin. And each single molecule is bulging with some 10,000 atoms of oxygen, and therefore Lance Parker needed 60 sextillion atoms of oxygen every minute of every hour of every day of just to stay alive. And she hadn't even considered the nutrients, the hormones, the antibodies, and God knew what else. Her fist raised as if it were possessed of its own command and banged down on the clear readout button. The millions and billions and trillions and sextillions winked out. Lee sucked in long, shuddering gasps of air, the very act of recognizing the impossibility of life coming close to strangling her. She sat in the dim glow of the waiting computer control console, and she looked up at the gleaming cybernetic system and how neatly it had doodled electronically about a living, thinking, loving human being, and very quietly she stood and looked again at the computer and said, "Fuck you," and it helped. And on that slightly odd note, because she's the one who told the computer to do all those things, that's where we're going to leave off. So it's off to a wham, it's off to a bang, and you're kind of probably wondering, although we've had hints, how exactly is this whole powered armor thing going to kick in? Well, you'll see. It's going to get weird. I trust you'll all be fine. So yeah, that's where we'll leave it off. This week we still have more reading from Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. And what's the other thing we're reading? Oh yes, The Jesus Incident by Frank Herbert and Bill Ransom on Friday. So we can look forward to those. I should have warned the first one for the Jesus Incident, and really going forward through the entire Pandora sequence, there's a not insignificant amount of body horror, mostly in the form of people who are in very strange and off-putting shapes. That's the primary thing. There's some other bits of body horror involved too, but that's most of it. There's some fairly squicky bits, the worst of which are mostly in this one. There's one or two in the Lazarus Effect, and there's really not much in the Ascension Factor. Nothing that's like deeply concerning. There's squicky bits in the Ascension Factor, but it's more just violence. Oh, sorry, I didn't see Optical Antenna's message. I have a friend who writes tech manuals for Apple. Never really thought about it, but I never thought to ask him if he ever wanted to write sci-fi. Well, probably could. Anyway, unless I decide enough's enough, I guess we'll keep doing ManFac, and I'll use it as therapy to get over long weekends. Incidentally, there's like no cover art for this book. I was able to find two. The first of which that you're seeing on screen now is and I could probably get a better picture of my copy because my copy looks a bit better. Is that's the same as my copy. The other one we'll see next week. So we'll be cycling through 4 different images, 2 for each cover art variant. Anyway, yeah, that'll do it for today. Thanks for tuning in. If anybody's tuning into this for the first time and wondering, hey, Frag, why is all this so rough and unprofessional and stuff? It's because I do these live, unedited, uncut, unfiltered, except by my own cutting and filtration mechanisms inside my own body. Incredible with its trillions of cells and hemoglobins. Every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday starting at 12 noon U.S. East Coast time. So whatever that is for you in your position in the globe, which I realize is not an ideal time frame for anyone to tune in live, but that's totally okay. I don't care when you tune in or if you tune in, and I'll never tell you to like, subscribe, or any of that business. That could be perceived as reverse psychology. That's not the intent. I honestly don't care. Just that people enjoy, and the people who do enjoy it. Um, it's a hobby. It's not. I'm not here to make a living. God knows. I disabused myself of that notion before I even started 5 odd years ago. I was like, this will be a fun hobby. We'll see where it goes. If I make money from it, cool. I'm not going to use it as a means of making a living because I already have a job. It's not an issue. So here we are. Yeah. So we'll keep on doing this. When the year ticks over, I will finish up whatever books I'm reading and then decide what I'm going to do from there in terms of, am I going to keep reading 3 times a week, or am I going to just do something different? I don't know. I will keep doing this though. Like, I'm not going to stop. It's not going to stop. I might change format slightly, but not a lot because I'm lazy and it's worked for this long. It's going to keep on working. To be totally blunt, I'm lazy. But this gives me a nice little hobby to do for a couple hours every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. So yeah, sees y'all later. Stay safe, stay sane, and be decent to each other. And if you're an Amerikanski like myself, make sure you're registered to vote, and please do. I'm not going to proselytize as to who you should vote for. We'll leave that up to your own conscience. But do vote. Uh, I'm not a huge fan of the electoral process and system, particularly for presidential elections. It sucks. It has a great way of diminishing the value of each individual vote, but you cannot complain about the result if you don't. So best you can do is vote and hope for the best, um, and go from there, and let things fall as they may. It's a race to the bottom. Sometimes it seems, but you can only do your best. Anyway, also, if you're protesting, I don't know of any active protests off the top of my head that are occurring around the world off the top of my head. Do make sure to do like a solid checklist. Have a buddy system. Don't have your phones on, for instance. They can track that stuff. I realize this sounds like me telling people how to do like a guerrilla army or whatever, but that's why we read The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, so that you know how to do that. Also, because it's a fascinating book. It's really good, and I recommend it for that reason. It's still, to this day, my least favorite reading. Not book, but reading. I wasn't happy with it. It was a lot of effort, and I felt like I was having to shift gears constantly, and partly I made it more difficult on myself, and partly it's just written in a way that's very difficult to read aloud. Brilliant read, though. I highly recommend not necessarily checking out my reading of it, but just checking out the book in general. It's very worth your time. There's an amount of Heinlein that's well worth checking out. That's absolutely one of them. Absolutely, I think his views on a free society are optimistic in the utmost. But the idea of doing a revolution in that way makes a lot of sense in terms of just if you're a revolutionary cell, here's how you build it. Anyway, good times. See you all later. I did the safe, sane, and be decent to each other thing. Yeah, I did. Okay, cool. Until next time.